Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Thanks for being with me, and I am joined for this conversation with Laura Sullivan, who is Senior Product Manager at Form3. And as you know, we at Payments always like to delve into what's next. So what next is certainly a lot of discussion about Fedwire, where we are, where we're headed. So thank you. Nice to have you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Let's dive right in. Fedwire, for those of us, those who might be watching and listening, may be less familiar with the role of Fedwire, where it fits into the equation for payments, and specifically really where we're headed. So give me a layperson's view, if you could, really where it fits in the pantheon of financial services, and specifically why it needs to be modernized.
So Fedwire is what is known as a real-time gross settlement system, and that's a lot of words, but what it basically means is that the payments that flow through that system are settled immediately with a bank's Federal Reserve account. So it has to be used by financial institutions who are members of the Federal Reserve in the US. And those payments are settled immediately, and they are irrevocable. So before the advent of the instant payment systems that we now have, TCH's RTP and FedNow, it was the only system that was irrevocable, meaning that when a payment was sent through that system, it really couldn't be asked, you couldn't get it back unless the receiving party agreed to it. So it was good funds. Has typically been used for fairly high dollar movement of money, but that isn't always the case. There are lower dollar values flowing through it as well.
And when we think about where we are right now, there is a lot of anticipation for ISO 2022, which promises to be a game changer for the way in which communication is done and messaging is done with transactions across the board. You and I both know the implementation of that, depending on where you look, may be staggered, may be delayed, may have its own challenges. What specifically would be happening to Fedwire in terms of modernizing and improving the process of doing these? As you mentioned, these are high dollar transactions, certainly I think would apply to a number of use cases. What would ISO 2022 do here?
Well, probably the single biggest thing that ISO will do for Fedwire is align it with many of the other payment systems around the world. There is a fairly significant portion of the Fedwire volume that actually ends up, either originates or ends up overseas. Most of those payments are flow through what's a network called Swift, and Swift has moved to ISO. So, those systems have never been aligned before in terms of using the same format. And I'm not going to say they're 100% match, because we've had to have that disappointing discussion with a lot of our customers that ISO is not necessarily one flavor, that different systems have implemented it slightly differently, but it is still vastly the same. So being able to transport data without fear of dropping data or having to wedge it into fields that aren't really fit for purpose is one of the biggest things with Fedwire. There are also some improvements in terms of messaging, much more standardized, a lot more response. So with Fedwire, certainly when you send a Fedwire to the Fed, you got a response saying, yeah, I got it. But if you sent a request for payment, which is called a drawdown in Fedwire terminology, or if you sent a request to have money returned to you, you didn't necessarily get a response unless it was a positive or a negative. Now there are specific message types that can be used to respond, even if it's just to say, yeah, I got it, I'm looking at it. But that's a huge difference for banks. At least you know somebody's paying attention to you, and you don't have to continually send follow-up messages to ask what's going on with it. So there's some definite improvements there. The big nirvana is expanded data, but I will say Fedwire, I don't remember how many years ago, had made a fairly aggressive effort to be able to support particularly remittance data or invoice data. And so it did a pretty good job of that. And frankly, there was not huge uptake on it. So that's something that as more systems migrate, we hope that we'll start to finally see that promise of that data flowing with the payments. But those are just some of the benefits. Another one that's not trivial is Fedwire was somewhat limited in the number of parties that you could reference in a payment. So if I was sending money to Merrill Lynch for my account at Merrill Lynch, it was challenging to get the format correct to say it's for Merrill Lynch because they're a customer of the bank, and then here's their customer. And so they've added a couple more parties on either end, an ultimate creditor and an ultimate debtor, which will help with that as well. So there really are just a number of benefits across the board for this implementation of this format.
With those technological and certainly data-rich benefits in the mix, how might we see a positive ripple effect accrue to the bank's customers? What use cases might change for the better? Does it result in better cash flow? Visibility certainly is in them. Is there, knowing you have a confirmation, hey, you got it, right? Or it's been sent, there's better transparency. What actually starts to improve? Are their entire do costs come down? Do certain large dollar transactions become a little bit easier to do? What do you think?
I mean, I think, again, it's the studies and the benefits really come in with getting that invoice information to travel with the payment. There have been some significant studies done, test cases with even small companies who can save a fortune in terms of reconciling their accounts receivable or their accounts payable if they have that data. So that's really where the customers are going to see the biggest benefit. Nobody has really cracked that nut in a significant way yet, but I feel like now that virtually all of the systems will support this, that we'll start to see banks and fintechs really hone in on how to provide and how to make use of that data so that it streamlines reconciliation, error handling, etc. At the customers. The other thing, as I mentioned, is the ability to provide the additional parties. So, Merrill Lynch isn't parsing through some details of payments field, it used to be called, for example, to try to figure out who this money is for and where to apply it. It's in a very structured field, and they can automate that application of those funds. So those are two of the significant benefits that will accrue from the new format.
What lessons might we be able to discern from the swift migration to ISO, and challenges, opportunities, maybe some lessons learned? I mentioned at the top of our conversation that other schemes are having their own issues in terms of implementing this or getting everybody ready. So now that we have some visibility, what are your thoughts about what Swift and the ISO migration there can teach us?
Well, one thing I will note is there's a trade association called the Bankers Association for Finance and Trade, BAFT, and they actually are publishing a paper in December on exactly that topic. So I would, ask people to keep an eye out for that. What we have heard anecdotally are some interesting things. Some of them not what you would expect. For example, because the address lines, because there's much more room to put in addresses for a customer, and many jurisdictions require that information. What the U.S. banks discovered as they started receiving the new SWIFT messages is that banks were suddenly populating all of this address info, and payments that had been flowing through without any issue previously, now we're getting stuck in sanctions filters because there was all this data that they weren't used to seeing. And they, often banks will set up rules to say, yeah, this customer's fine, but suddenly they were seeing this additional address data that the systems flagged and had to be reviewed. So there have been some unintended consequences of that. It's the right direction, but we've got to work through that. And so that has been one of the challenges that I think really surprised banks, where the number of, what in the industry is called false positives on those sanctions scans skyrocketed, because they were suddenly getting all this address data that they'd never seen before. So, that's a big one. Other than that, it's really gone surprisingly smoothly. The banks have handled it fairly well.
Your point there about sanction screening is an important one. I'd like to stick on it for a minute. So when all is said and done, the migration is done well, and some of these bugs are ironed out. What happened to OFAC scanning, fraud detection, defenses, really making sure the integrity of the transactions is as pristine as it might be? How does ISO wind up improving that level of scrutiny of the payments?
Well, it's interesting, because I think it's still going to take some time. So the promise was, the belief was that the industry would mandate truly structured addresses. What they've found, and I'm afraid that a lot of the blame may go on the US. I can't speak outside of the US, but all of the the checking and savings account systems in the US aren't necessarily very good at structuring addresses. So what everybody thought would have, and the ISO address format is extremely detailed, like your street number goes here, your street goes here, your city, your country, your zip, all have discrete fields. And they originally had thought in 2025 that they would enforce that. The beauty of that is, if I have a sanctioned entity that is a street name and I can identify it as such, I don't have to worry about it. So, however, they have backed off of that, because I think the banks rightly said we can't get there. And so they're still going to have the city and country as of the end of 2025. The city and country will still be required to be in precise fields, which, even that, as simple as it sounds, is a vast improvement, because in the current Fedwire format, there is no specific field for that. So for things like sanction scanning, anti-money laundering checks, etc., that is still a big improvement. And banks should be able to improve that sanction scanning. There are a lot of interesting things happening. There's also a consortium that a lot of the bigger banks have put together and created a sanction scanning service that they intend to market or be able to use across multiple banks globally, and centralize that sanction scanning to improve that friction, both as a cost savings to the bank, but as a removing the friction in the payment system that slows down payments for those of us who are legitimate users of the services. So there's a lot happening in that arena that isn't necessarily driven by ISO, but I think people have realized, if ISO isn't going to solve it, it's got to be solved somehow.
Let's look ahead a bit if we could. So is it conventional wisdom may hold that some volume is going to switch from Fedwire to FedNow, as FedNow gains some traction out there, and we reach certainly more FIs coming on board to do this. Is that a reasonable expectation? Are there things that Fedwire will keep close to its own, that winds up being, there will be some choices made to migrate some volume away from Fedwire, but Fedwire will be the instrument of choice for other types of use cases? Or is it the case that we really won't see much change at all?
I think there will be some change. I think it will be gradual. I saw an interesting article the other day where somebody was putting forth the premise that perhaps the Fed would put a a minimum dollar amount threshold on Fedwire and say if it's below X dollars, then you should send this Fed now, which was really fascinating. One of the big distinctions between the instant payment systems and Fedwire is the dollar limit cap. I think last time I looked, the average Fedwire is something like $5 million. So it is still used to move big volumes of money, and a lot of it is intra-bank, bank to bank, as opposed to customer oriented. So I don't think that will go away. The other difference is, FedNow is priced. It's less expensive than Fedwire from a pure what the Federal Reserve is charging the banks. And so that will ultimately potentially push volume from Fedwire to FedNow. So I would suggest that some of those lower dollar payments that are being made on Fedwire will get moved to instant payments, but I think it will be very gradual. I don't think we're going to see any huge movement just because of the infrastructure that exists.
Right, okay, that's a great point. So gradual pace of change, incremental, maybe no deluge, and certainly nobody should be ringing the bell for Fedwire. So it's a great point. So Laura, I want to thank you for the time. Thank you for the conversation. We'll look ahead and see where we might be with ISO, perhaps in a future conversation, and we'll see where things stand.
Great, thanks so much.